Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we are going to do a comparison of all the different Anbernic devices that have the word RGXX in them. Over the past year we have seen 8 different releases with the exact same chipset, so the performance and everything else is exactly the same. However, as you can imagine, because there are so many options, it gets really confusing to figure out which one might be the best fit for you. Now, I've made in-depth reviews about each of these devices, I'll leave it all linked down below, but in this video we're just going to compare them all head on. So we'll talk about why I think these devices are pretty great for the price, and then a couple caveats and why you may want to avoid them as well. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start by talking about why you may want to consider one of these RGXX devices. And first and foremost is the price point. On average, you'll be able to find these for around $65. It all depends on where you shop and whether or not you can find a sale. AliExpress is usually going to be the cheapest, but Amazon will be the most convenient. And I think that $65 price point is really compelling. If you think about it, it's about the same price as a brand new Xbox or PS5 game, but of course, instead of just getting one game, you'll have access to thousands of games instead. Now, another reason I like these devices is because the build quality is relatively solid. Bearing in mind that these are relatively cheap devices, I think the quality here is pretty good. The buttons, the controls, and just the overall feel. Another benefit of having 8 different devices all running the same chipset is that they can also take advantage of custom firmware. And so there are a bunch of different operating solutions you can use. To start, the operating system that comes with the device is not half bad. There's also a modified version that will make it even better. If you're looking for something really simple and lightweight, there's one called MinUI. I think this one is really good, especially if you're going to be handing it off maybe as a gift. And then finally, we've got a couple other more robust options, including Newly as well as MooOS. And I've covered all this stuff extensively in a written starter guide. I'll leave it linked down below. But essentially what you can do here is you can go through each of these different operating systems, see the pros and cons, and see which one might be the best fit for you. In addition, I've got video guides that will walk you through that setup process. And then finally, one other benefit is that these are some of the cheapest devices you can find that give you access to Portmaster. And Portmaster is essentially an app that works on Linux-based handhelds that will give you access to PC ports. And so beyond all of these systems that you can emulate on this device, this Portmaster app will give you access to nearly 700 games as well. And some of these are a really excellent fit for these retro handhelds, including Stardew Valley, Shovel Knight, and UFO 50. Now, as much as I like these devices, they do come with some caveats. I don't think that they're perfect, so I wanted to give you a few warnings before we dive into it. The first caveat is that we have some charging limitations with this line of devices. If you look at the back of each of these devices, under the adapter input, you will see that it says 5 watts and 1.5 amps. And that's the recommended charging input for these devices, and many other options will not work. So for example, if you've got one of those USB-C fast chargers for your phone, it's not going to work on these handhelds. Instead, you're better off using one of these like cheap chargers that used to come with old phones. You can also find them on Amazon for very cheap. And I'll leave a link to one down below, but essentially, yeah, you're going to want to look for something that's 5 volts and 1.5 amps or lower. So just bear in mind, you're not going to be able to fast charge these devices. It'll take a couple hours to charge them. Thankfully, the battery life on all these devices is pretty good. It's about the same, about 6 to 8 hours depending on what you're playing. Another thing to keep in mind is because these are relatively cheap devices, they have some pretty cheap components as well. And so much like with other cheaper handhelds like this, there will be some things that break from time to time. And it's hard to predict what those issues will be. Sometimes it's the screen or maybe the hinge on one of the clamshell devices, things like that. So just keep in mind that these are devices that I would not expect to last forever, especially compared to something that's going to be a lot more expensive. Another caveat I have for these devices are the analog sticks, both from a hardware and software perspective. Now, when it comes to hardware, it's nothing really surprising. It's just that they're using somewhat cheaper sticks. These are essentially the same kind of sticks that you'll find in a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con. And so they do have a limited range of motion. Now, additionally, in the software, these sticks have been prone to what they call cardinal snapping. That means when you move them in a circle, they will usually focus only on the north, south, east, and west points, as well as the corners. And so instead of feeling like a true analog input, it feels more like an 8-way joystick. Now, personally, I don't really mind that because most of the time when I am using the joystick, it's for arcade games, and so it's always been a pretty good fit for me. However, when playing something like PlayStation 1 or Nintendo 64, something with a true analog stick input, it can feel limiting. Now, thankfully, we have seen some software fixes from the community, so if you try out one of those community operating systems, it will mostly fix the issue. We're still kind of limited by just the hardware itself, so it doesn't feel like a really good analog stick, but at least the cardinal snapping is a lot less. Now, finally, the last caveat I have is that even though we have seen 8 of these devices come out so far, far, I don't think these are the last ones that we're going to see. In fact, just yesterday, we saw a potential leak for what may be Anbernic's next handheld. It looks like this one's going to be called the RG Arc XX, and so it looks like an older device that they had made previously, the RG Arc, with a 6-button layout. And so the reason why I'm calling this a caveat is because even the 8 devices that we're showing off here today may not be a perfect match for you, but there may be something later down the line that is. And so I think it's always good to give a bit of warning in that the longer that you wait to pick up one of these devices, you will have even more choice. So now let's briefly go over each of those 8 devices so we know what the major players are. And it all started with this device. This is the Anbernic RG35XX. This one came out a couple years ago and has a vertical form factor and was actually a really nice device when it first came out. But then about a year ago, they released this one. This is the RG35XX Plus. And this one is very similar to the other one, but with some big improvements, including better shoulder buttons, a battery compartment, but then also Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And perhaps most importantly, this is the first device that came out with that new chipset, the Allwinner H700. So all the other devices that have come out since this one have the same chipset, and that's why they can all share the same firmwares. Now next they released the RG35XXH. This is a horizontal form factor, but almost the exact same device. There are some key differences. For example, it has dual analog sticks as well as stereo speakers, but for the most part, it is very similar to other devices Anbernic has released before. And for the first few months after the release of this device, it was easily my favorite. I love how compact it is and very ergonomic. Now after that, Anbernic released this one, the RG28XX. This one is very similar to the one we were just looking at, but it is smaller. It's only had a 2.8-inch screen compared to 3.5. And I think this one is okay, especially if you want something very pocketable, but for me, this one just never really clicked. Now these devices have been dropping like every month, and so it's hard to keep straight which one released in which month, but I think the next one was the RG35XX SP. And as the name implies, this is very similar to the Game Boy Advance SP. It's a clamshell and everything. This one has the same 3.5-inch screen, but has clickier controls compared to the other ones, which are rubber membrane. They've also released a bunch of different color options for it and have improved the controls as well. These two are my favorite colors, the silver as well as the transparent red. Another release from Anbernic is this one, which is called the RG35XX 2024. Now that's a super confusing name, and it's also a very confusing handheld. This one does have that newer H700 chip inside of it, but it has the older shell from the original 35XX. So that means it has the worst shoulder buttons and no battery compartment, and is also lacking Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And as I mentioned in my review video, I kind of find this one to be pointless. It's worse than this one, but only about $5 cheaper, and I personally think that in most cases you'll probably go with this one anyway. But if you're looking for a purely offline device and you don't really mind having these worse shoulder buttons, then sure, you could save $5. After that, Anbernic released this one. This is the RG40XXH. This one is similar to the others, but has a 4-inch display as well as stacked shoulders and triggers. And on paper, this is exactly the type of device I want because I love having 4-inch displays on these cheaper handhelds, but there were a couple things that held me back. Number one, I didn't like the controls on the D-pad, although I have been told by some pretty reliable sources that they've updated it. I've ordered a couple to actually test it out, but I haven't got them in the mail yet. So I am going to assume that these now have an improved D-pad, but as it stands right now, yeah, I wasn't super impressed with the launch release. The other thing that held me back about this device is that I found it actually to be a little bit too thin, and that's because the chip, which is right here, actually makes the back of the device very warm when you're playing it. And so I found that basically playing anything from Super Nintendo and beyond would heat up the device to the point where I didn't enjoy it. And then finally, for some strange reason, this one has a very slick plastic texture, and I never really liked that either. And when you combine that with the overall heat radiating from the device, I think these two are a pretty bad combo. After that, we had this device. So this is the RG40XXV. This one is a lot like the RG35XX Plus, but with a 4-inch screen instead. And boy, oh boy, do I really love this screen. It has tiny little bezels, which makes the device look super premium. It also has a single analog stick, which has come in handy, especially when it comes to arcade games. This one also fixed all the D-pad issues I had with the previous model, and so I was really happy with this one altogether. Especially when it comes to the overall design and sleekness of this handheld, it really can't be beat at this price point. And finally, we've got this big boy. This is the RG Cube XX, which just came out the other day. And this one has a very unique screen. It is 4 inches, but a square aspect ratio with a resolution of 720 by 720. And as I demonstrated in my review video, this gives us a ton of options when it comes to scaling retro systems. In addition, it's got an old school style Sega D-pad, which I think is pretty awesome. And it also has stacked shoulders and triggers and these nice ergonomic bumps, which makes it very comfortable to hold. Okay, so that's a quick recap of all the devices within this line that have released released from Anbernic over the past year. And so now we're going to sit down and rank them by each category and then tally all of that at the end. And as we get started, I have 2 points to make. The first is that this is super subjective. It's basically what I enjoy in a handheld and what I think is the best. And so if you don't agree with any of these rankings, it's totally cool. I get it. Everyone's got their own preferences. And then finally, no matter what ranking we give for each of the categories, I think it all comes down to the form factor. If you're specifically looking for a vertical handheld or a horizontal one or something that's small or a clamshell, I think that will inform your choice more than anything. Because like I mentioned, they all have the same chips, so the performance will be about the same. It's all about what you think is going to be the best fit for you. Okay, so now let's jump into the actual comparison. So here's the table that we're going to be looking at for the next few minutes, and I have all these devices listed basically by size. So the RG28XX, which is definitely the smallest one, is at the top, and then the RG Cube XX, which I think is the largest one, is at the bottom. And here's also a breakdown of all the different price points, and like I mentioned, they will vary depending on where you're shopping. In addition, the longer the device has been on the market, you will often find third-party retailers that will put them on sale as well. We've already talked a bit about the screen size and resolution, but here you can see a listing of them one by one. And by the way, if you didn't know already, that's what these numbers mean. So 2.8 means 2.8 inches, 3.5 means 3.5, and 4.0 means 4. And they've all got the same resolution of 640 by 480, with exception to the RG Cube XX, which is 720 by 720. So let's start with our first category, which is going to be performance. And I'm just going to grade everything here with a B. And that's because, like I mentioned, it's got the same chip, and so performance is going to be the same across the board. In a nutshell, you'll be able to play almost every single PS1 game at full speed, and you'll be able to play a fair amount of Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PSP. Let's move on to the next category, which is going to be controls, and specifically what I'm talking about here are the buttons as well as the analog sticks. Let's start with the outliers, including the RG28XX, which I gave a C. And this comes down to the fact that I find the face buttons on this device to be too small. And it's not to the point where it's a deal breaker for me, but it does prevent me from enjoying this device as much as I could. Now for all the other devices, the controls are pretty good. I've given them mostly A's and B's. The RG35XX 2024 has those worse shoulder buttons, and so I think that's worse than the 35XX Plus. And then like I mentioned, the RG40XXH had a pretty lousy D-pad, at least at launch, but I have heard it's better. The only one I gave an S tier to, which is the highest ranking, is the RG40XXV. And this has to do with the fact that it is basically a pitch-perfect D-pad for me, and I really do like rubber membranes as well. And so this is the only one where I think the controls are the closest to perfect as they can be. So now let's talk about the ergonomics, and this will vary depending on the device. Again, the RG28XX is on the lower end here with a C, and this has to do with the fact that because it's a micro device, it is relatively cramped. I also put the vertical RG35XXs in the C category as well, because being vertical and somewhat small, they are a little bit cramped too. For all the others, I gave them an A or a B, and then the RG Cube XX, I gave that S tier. And that's because we've got those ergonomic bumps, and it's a nice roomy handheld as well, and so I find this one to be the most comfortable. The next category is heat transfer. That's how much the device heats up while you're playing it. And for this, I found that the 40XXH is the worst. This one is to the point where I actually don't enjoy playing it with those systems. And again, that has to do with the fact that the device is just a little bit too thin for my tastes. The RG28XX as well as the SP will get a little bit warm, especially when playing PS1 and above. But to me, it's not to the point where I actually avoid playing this device because of the heat transfer. And as you can see here, I also gave out 4 S tiers, and that's because for these 4 devices, you just can't feel the heat at all. For those with a vertical orientation, it's because the CPU is behind the screen, which is not where your hands are going to be. And so even though it is radiating heat, you're just not going to feel it. The RG Cube is very similar as well. Because it has those thicker ergonomic grips, you just don't feel that heat. I think it's great. Next, let's talk about the screen. So I gave the 28XX the lowest ranking, and part of that has to do with the fact that it's a small screen, only 2.8 inches, but then also it's the dimmest of all these screens that we've seen as well. And so that's the only one that I gave a C ranking to. Everything else is pretty great. I do prefer a 4-inch screen, so I gave those ones a higher ranking, and then I also think that the RG Cube XX screen is the best among them. And I spent a long time talking about that in my review video of the Cube XX, but essentially this scales really well for most retro systems. Those that have a squarish orientation like Game Boy are going to look amazing on here, and you can also play a lot of 4:3 games in a 8:7 aspect ratio, which will fill up a lot of the screen as well. And then finally, just plain old 4:3 stuff looks really good too. Okay, let's talk about audio, and I think that in general it's relatively good for each of these devices, but not great. For 4 of these handhelds, I gave them a C ranking. That's because they have mono audio, a single speaker, and then also that speaker is on the bottom right. And that means when you're playing it, your hand will often muffle the sound a little bit because it's covering the speaker. Now the 35XX SP I gave a B ranking because even though it does have a mono speaker, it's in the center of the handheld and you won't cover it up. And for the other 3 handhelds, they have stereo speakers, although they are down-firing, so they're not going to be perfect. They're not an S tier, but I still think they're better. Next category is pocketability, and I think the 28XX wins in this one. After all, it's easily the smallest of all these handhelds, and so it's very easy to take around in your pocket. The next 2 devices I like to throw in my pocket are the 35XXH as well as the SP. The SP is still a little bit thicker than I would like, but I love the fact that it's a clamshell, so it protects the device in your pocket. You can also throw those B tier handhelds in your pocket, but I find these to be just a little bit more bulkier than I would like. And then finally, for the bottom 2 handhelds, I wouldn't really consider these to be very pocketable, and so I gave them a C. Now the next few categories are pretty easy. For example, with the operating system options, they all can play the same custom firmwares, and so as a result, I gave them all an A. I think the amount of choice that we have here is one of the reasons why I like these devices so much. Now for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, it's very similar, but 2 of these devices do not have Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. That is the RG28XX as well as the 35XX 2024. And this can be a good or a bad thing depending on what you prefer, but I personally do like having Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. That allows me to download games from Portmaster and use retro achievements, all the other things I talk about in my other videos. Next, when it comes to HDMI output, thankfully all of these have hookups for it. So all you need is a mini HDMI cable or a converter, and you'll be able to hook these up to a TV or a monitor. And again, that's one of my favorite things about these devices because it allows you to basically consoleize them and just get a lot more mileage out of them as well. And then finally, the last category here is fun factor. So this is essentially how often I actually use these handhelds. Given the fact that I have all 8 of these, plus a bunch of other handhelds to test, it always really comes down to which ones I enjoy the most. Easily the handheld I use the least is the RG35XX 2024, just because I think it is a worse version of the 35XX Plus, which I already have. In addition, I don't really use the 28XX either because I have a lot of other smaller handhelds that I prefer over this one. When it comes down to it, the 2 handhelds I think that have the most fun factor for me personally are the RG Cube XX as well as the 35XX SP. The SP is basically my travel-friendly handheld. That's the one I bring with me every time because it's a clamshell. And even though the RG Cube XX just recently came out, I've been using the original RG Cube for months at this point. And so even though I've only had it for about a week, I know that this is going to be my horizontal handheld going forward. Okay, so now that we've ranked out each of the categories, I did apply a number value to them as well. And this is a very simple system. I assigned 5 points for S, 4 for A, and so on. From there, I just added everything up and you can see these scores in pink on the far right. And so if we were only going by points, then that means that the RG Cube XX would actually win. From there, we'd have a tie between the 35XXH as well as the 40XXV. And then finally, the other one worth noting is the RG35XXSP, which is only a couple points behind. Now, the way I see it, numbers don't mean everything. And so in addition to just a overall score ranking, I wanted to talk about my favorites and why. And I think it really comes down to these 3 models, the SP, the 40XXV, as well as the Cube XX. And I think that in each of their form factor categories, these are probably going to be my biggest recommendations. The SP is a no-brainer because it's a clamshell. So if you're looking for something to remind you of the original Game Boy Advance SP, this is easily the best choice. Same thing with if you prefer a vertical handheld, the 40XXV, even though it is a bit larger than the other, I think that screen is totally worth it. And when it comes to horizontal form factors, the RG Cube XX is my current favorite. It's definitely larger and less pocketable than the others, but I really love that screen when it comes to scaling, and it's also super comfortable. And if you're wondering what my top overall pick is, that's the RG35XXSP. There are obviously a lot of factors that go into this, and it's also very personal, but for me, it's the clamshell form factor. It just makes it so convenient to use. When I'm in the middle of a game, all I've got to do is just close the clamshell shut. That's going to pause the game, save where I am, and then power off the device. Then the next time that I power on the device, I'll be able to resume exactly where I was before, and I've talked about this in detail in my other videos as well. And so it's probably no surprise to anyone that the 35XXSP is my favorite among all of these. Now, before we wrap up, I did want to talk about a few alternatives because these Anbernic devices are not the only ones out on the market by a long shot. So I did want to mention that if you are interested in any of these particular handhelds, there are others that I recommend over them. Let's start with the Miyoo Mini Plus. I think if you're going to buy a 3.5-inch vertical handheld, this is the one that I prefer. I think the controls on this device are better. I also prefer the shoulder buttons, and it's more flush and pocketable. In addition, the operating system on this, which is called Onion OS, is amazing. I've made a bunch of videos about it. However, one caveat is that this does not have HDMI out, nor does it have Bluetooth. So if those are important to you, then you may want to get the 3.5XX Plus instead. Now, when it comes to smaller handhelds, I think there are many that are better than the RG28XX. In fact, just recently I made a roundup of my favorite micro handhelds, and to be honest, this one didn't even really make the list. The two main ones I would recommend checking out are going to be this one, the XU Mini M if you want a horizontal form factor, and then the original Miyoo Mini if you want something vertical. And I'll leave that other wrap-up video linked down below if you want to watch more about it. And then finally, if you're looking for a larger device like the RG40XXH, and maybe you want something with a bigger screen and a rounded side to it, I think the TrimUI Smart Pro is worth investigating. This one can also run the Newly operating system, but has a much bigger and more beautiful screen. Now this one is also prone to heating up, but thankfully because it's a wider device, your hands aren't going to feel it as much. And of note, even though this does have Wi-Fi, it does not have video out. So if that's important to you, then it may be worth getting this one instead. But I think between the two, I definitely play the TrimUI Smart Pro more, and this one is also cheaper. And without sounding too much like a broken record, I've got videos about this guy as well. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I wanted to show off my favorites among the RGXX series. And among them, these three are my favorite, and among these three, it's going to be the RG35XXSP. So let me know what you think in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.